Welcome back to the Worthington Chronicles, where every story is a new adventure. If you're loving our tales of romance and redemption, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this story with a friend who needs a happy escape. Now, let's begin our next story. The Silent Sonata. The silence in the old house was a living, breathing entity. It wasn't an absence of sound, but a presence. A heavy velvet weight that pressed against Lindsay's eardrums, until they ached with the strain of listening to nothing. The air itself tasted of undisturbed dust, a fine, chalky powder that coated the tongue. Every breath she took was a small disturbance in the profound stillness, and the soft thump of her own heart was a secret, frantic drumbeat against the quiet. Her only anchor in the vast mausoleum-like space was Daffodil. The little dog's warmth was a small sun against her leg, a constant living reassurance. Burying her face in the Yorkie poodle's fur, Lindsay inhaled a scent that was pure. Simple life, faintly of chamomile shampoo and the sweet musky smell of a beloved pet. It was the only scent that didn't smell of loss. Her escape was her violin. The moment the polished wood settled against her jaw, the world shifted. She drew the bow across the strings, and a single clear note hung in the dusty air. But in her mind, it was a key turning in a lock. The silence shattered. A symphony erupted within her, a private, glorious explosion of sensation. The note from her violin blossomed into a deep, resonant cello line that she could taste on her tongue. Rich and dark, like 90% cacao, complex and slightly bitter. A flute joined in, its melody a cool, silvery trickle that felt like the touch of moonlight on her skin. Then, a trumpet, its fanfare a blinding, brilliant gold that flashed behind her closed eyelids, so bright it was almost painful. The music wasn't something she heard. It was something that happened to her, a tide of sensation that flooded her veins, warming the perpetual chill in her chest. For these precious moments, the house wasn't a tomb, it was a cathedral, and she was both its priestess and its congregation. The final trembling note faded from the strings. The real world rushed back in, its silence now feeling thin and brittle. Her gaze drifted automatically to the large window that overlooked the neighboring garden. He was there. Cassian. He moved with a quiet, unnerving efficiency, trimming the hedges with sharp, precise snips. But his movements were too fluid, too controlled, for a simple gardener. It was the way a panther might move through the jungle, every motion purposeful, every sense attuned to its surroundings. When his eyes, the color of a storm-churned sea, flickered up and met hers through the glass, a jolt went through her system. It was a physical sensation, a confusing cocktail of unease and a strange magnetic pull that felt like a low, dissonant chord vibrating deep in her bones. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, by someone who was more a predator than a neighbor. The look lasted only a second before he returned to his work, but the unsettling echo of it lingered in her chest long after, a question mark hanging in the quiet air. The memory was a ghost that lived in the walls, and it chose its moments to step out of the shadows. It happened as she played a particular melancholic adagio, the notes tasting of old honey and dried rose petals. Sweet, but with the sharp edges of regret. The music pulled her under, and suddenly, she wasn't in the silent mansion. She was 10 years old, standing in the sun-drenched kitchen. The air was thick with the sweet, buttery smell of her father's famous pancakes. The sound of his deep, rumbling laughter was a physical warmth against her skin. She could feel the safe, solid weight of his hand resting on her head. A touch that promised the world was a good and safe place. Then the memory twisted. The warmth was ripped away, replaced by the cold dread of a pre-dawn hour 3 years ago. The violent, urgent knocking at the front door was a sound that still lived in her muscles, making them clench even now. The metallic, coppery taste of pure fear flooded her mouth, so real she could swallow it. Her father's face, pale and grim. In the hallway light, his eyes wide with a terror she had never seen before. His voice, an urgent, breathless whisper as he pushed her toward the stairs, was a chill slithering down her spine. "Remember the attic, Linz. If anything happens." The memory broke, leaving her gasping in the present, the violin bow trembling in her hand. The housekeeper, Mrs. Albright, was standing in the doorway, her face a mask of pinched discomfort. "I'm sorry, Lindsay," she said, her voice cutting through the lingering echoes of panic. "It's just too quiet here. I can't connect. I can't stay." The words were a cold draft, bringing with them the familiar, sterile smell of abandonment. It was a scent she knew well, the faint odor of bleach and emptiness that lingered after people decided she was too much trouble. Lindsay simply nodded, her throat a locked vault. She bent down and gathered Daffodil into her arms, the dog's steady, panting breaths a small, warm rhythm against the cold, hollow opening inside her. Days later, a sound like a gunshot tore through her musical sanctuary. It was a violent, jagged rip in the fabric of her world, the explosive shattering of glass from her father's old study downstairs. The discordant, terrifying noise ripped through the beautiful symphony in her mind, leaving a ringing, painful void in its wake. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, caged bird beating itself to death. The taste of dust in the air was suddenly replaced by the sharp, clean scent of danger. Before a scream could even form in her tight throat, a solid, immovable presence filled the doorway to the music room. Cassian. He hadn't knocked, he hadn't called out. He was just there. His arrival as silent and sudden as a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. The air now tasted of ozone and cold, hard intent. He moved past her without a word, his body a study of lethal grace as he disappeared toward the study, his every step silent on the Persian rug. Her own feet felt rooted to the floor, her blood a river of ice. A moment later, his low, calm baritone cut through the pounding in her ears. "Are you hurt?" The sound of his voice was so steady, so utterly controlled, that it felt like a solid hand on her shoulder, an anchor in the sudden, terrifying storm. She managed to shake her head, her breath still caught in her lungs. She heard him moving in the study, the soft crunch of glass under his shoes. When he reappeared, his face was a grim mask. In his hand, he held a single beige file folder. He held it out to her. A single word was typed on the tab, a word that felt cold and heavy as a stone. Orpheum. "The police are on their way," he said, his voice still that same infuriatingly calm pitch. But his eyes were scanning the room, the windows, the shadows, missing nothing. "But I'm not leaving you here alone tonight." He didn't ask. It was a statement of fact, a decree. His presence was no longer just an unsettling glimpse from a window. It had become a new, unshakable, and terrifying reality in her life. The next few hours were a blur of harsh, artificial light and the low murmur of official voices. The police moved through the rooms, their heavy footsteps and the crackle of their radios a jarring invasion of the mansion's sacred silence. Lindsay sat stiffly on the edge of a velvet settee, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she could physically hold the shattered pieces of her composure together. Daffodil trembled in her lap, a tiny, frightened heartbeat against her own. Through it all, Cassian was a statue. He stood near the fireplace, a silent, watchful sentinel. He answered the officer's questions with a clipped, unnerving efficiency, his gaze constantly sweeping the room, assessing, calculating. The air around him seemed to vibrate with a contained energy that made the fine hairs on Lindsay's arms stand up. He wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was a fortress, and his sheer, immovable presence was both a relief and a profound disturbance. When the last officer finally left, the heavy front door clicking shut with a sound of grim finality, the silence that descended was different. It was no longer empty. It was charged. Thick with unspoken questions and the lingering scent of fear. Cassian turned to her, the firelight carving sharp planes of shadow and light on his face. "You should pack a bag," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "You can't stay." Here, the command, delivered so matter-of-factly, sent a spark of defiance through her fear. "I'm not leaving my home." Her own voice sounded small, but it held a thread of steel she didn't know she still possessed. His stormy eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw something flicker in their depths. Not anger, but a weary understanding. "Then I'm not leaving you in it." He didn't wait for her argument. He simply picked up his own small duffel bag, which she hadn't even noticed by the door, and carried it toward the guest room down the hall. The message was clear. The argument was over. And so a new, surreal rhythm began. The house, once a sanctuary, for one, now held the sounds of two. The pre-dawn quiet was broken by the rich, earthy aroma of coffee he brewed, a scent that was both alien and strangely comforting. In the evenings, she would hear the soft rustle of a book's pages as he sat, reading in the library, a solid, silent figure amidst the towering shelves. His presence was a constant, low-grade hum in her periphery, a dissonant note that refused to resolve. She found herself playing her violin less, the music feeling exposed and vulnerable under his silent observation. When she did play, the melodies that came out were different. They were sharper, more guarded, the once sweet flute lines now edged with the metallic taste of a watchful gaze. She was composing a new symphony, one of tension and wary coexistence, and the main theme was the unsettling magnetic pull of the man who had invaded her silence. Days bled into one another. He didn't pry. He didn't ask about the file or her, father, or the ghosts that clearly haunted the halls. He was just there, a constant. A wall between her and the unknown threat named Orpheum. One evening, as a cold rain lashed against the windows, he broke the unspoken rule of their non-communication. He stood in the doorway of the music room while she was attempting to tune her violin, her fingers clumsy with a restless energy she couldn't name. "We need to talk about the attic," he said, his voice cutting through the soft patter of the rain. Her head snapped up. "What about it? Your father told you to remember it. You searched it once. We're going to search it again." His tone left no room for debate. "My eyes are different from yours." A cold knot tightened in her stomach. The attic was a place of failure, of dust-choked hope. The thought of returning there, of reliving that crushing disappointment with this intense, scrutinizing stranger as a witness was unbearable. But the look in his eyes wasn't cruel. It was determined. It was the look of a man who knew how to find things that were hidden. Swallowing the lump of dread in her throat, she gave a single, tight nod. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, her heart hammering against her ribs not just with fear, but with a terrifying, traitorous spark of something else. The first faint flutter of hope. The air in the attic was thick and still, heavy with the scent of forgotten things, aged cedar, brittle paper, and the faint, sweet decay of dried flowers. Dust motes danced in the single slanted beam of sunlight cutting through the grimy window, swirling like lazy ghosts. Lindsay's throat tightened, the taste of failure as familiar and bitter as the dust on her tongue. She stood frozen just inside the doorway, the memory of her frantic, hopeless search 3 years ago washing over her in a suffocating wave. She could still feel the gritty texture of the floorboards under her knees, the hollow echo of her own sobs in the cramped space. Cassian moved past her, his presence a disruption in the stagnant air. He didn't rush. His gaze was a physical thing, sweeping over the stacked trunks and shrouded furniture with a methodical, unnerving precision. He ran a hand along the wooden slats of the wall, his fingers probing, testing. "You looked in the trunks," he stated, his voice a low vibration in the quiet. "Yes," she whispered, the word tasting of dust. "You looked under the furniture." "Yes." He moved to the center of the room, his boots making no sound on the bare planks. He stood perfectly still, his eyes closed for a moment, as if listening to the silence itself. Then, his eyes opened, and they locked onto a section of the floor, near the far wall. It looked exactly like every other part, worn, dusty, unremarkable. He knelt, his movements fluid and sure. He brushed away the layer of grime with his palm, his fingers tracing the nearly invisible seams in the wood grain. Lindsay held her breath, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. The anticipation was a high, tight string pulled to its breaking point inside her chest. Then she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible click. that was louder than a gunshot in the tense silence. A small, perfectly disguised section of the floorboard lifted away in his hand, revealing a dark, hidden compartment. The air rushed from her lungs. The world seemed to tilt. Inside the compartment lay two objects. A simple, leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft with age, and a small, sleek black USB drive. Cassian picked them up, his expression unreadable. He stood and turned to her, holding them out. The look in his eyes was no longer that of a detached guardian. It was something deeper, more intense. A shared understanding passed between them in the dusty attic air. This was it. The truth her father had left for her. The answer to the silence. The reason for the shattering glass and the file marked Orpheum. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingertips brushing against his as she took the journal and the drive. The contact was electric, a jolt of shared purpose that shot up her arm. The hope she had buried for so long was no longer a flutter. It was a live wire, humming with terrifying, exhilarating power. The search was over. The real mystery was just beginning. Lindsay's hands were trembling so violently she could barely grip the journal and the USB drive. The descent from the attic felt like walking through a dream. The familiar house now rendered alien and charged with terrifying possibility. Cassian led her to her father's old study, the room where the glass had been shattered and where the ghost of Orpheum now lived. The air still carried the faint, clean scent of the police's fingerprint powder, a stark contrast to the smell of old leather and secrets they now carried with them. He closed the door, the soft click a sound of finality. The only light came from her father's massive antique desk lamp, casting a warm, intimate pool of light in the otherwise dark room. It felt like they were in a lifeboat, adrift in a vast, dark ocean. Ready? Cassian's voice was low, a quiet anchor in the storm of her emotions. She wasn't, but she nodded, her throat too tight for words. She handed him the USB drive, her fingers brushing his again. This time, the electric jolt was followed by a wave of profound, bone-deep trust. He was the only solid thing in her crumbling world. He inserted the drive into the computer on the desk. The screen glowed to life. There was only one file on it, labeled simply, "For Linz." With a final shaky breath, she double-clicked. Her father's face filled the screen. He was sitting in this very study, but he looked years older. The lines on his face etched deep by a worry she had never seen. The sight of him, so real, so close, was a physical blow. A small, wounded sound escaped her lips. Cassian's hand came to rest on her shoulder. A steadying, warm weight. "Linz, my darling girl," her father began, his voice raspy with emotion. "If you're seeing this, then you found it. And it means I'm not there." He took a shuddering breath. "I need you to be brave. Braver than you've ever had to be." He explained it all then, his words painting a picture of a nightmare. His life's work, a revolutionary acoustic technology he called the Sonata protocol, a sonic key that could bypass any digital or physical lock. It wasn't a weapon, he insisted, his eyes pleading with her through the screen. It was a tool for peace, for accessing information to prevent disasters. But a powerful, shadowy organization, Orpheum, had discovered it. They wanted it. They had threatened him, and worse, they had threatened her. "I transferred everything to you, Linz," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. "The house, the patents, the trusts. It was the only way to create a legal fortress around you. They can't touch it if it's yours." Then he leaned closer to the camera, his face filling the screen, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. His voice dropped to a whisper, a sound that seemed to suck all the air from the room. "They think I'm dead, Linz. The car accident. It was staged. It was the only way to throw them off, to make them stop looking, to keep you safe." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "If you're seeing this, it means my plan to disappear worked. I can't tell you where I am, but know this. I am fighting to get back to you. I am not gone. Tears she had held back for 3 years finally broke free, streaming down her face in silent, hot rivers. The heavy stone of grief in her chest didn't vanish, but it cracked open, and from it spilled a terrifying, painful, dizzying hope. He was alive. The words echoed in her soul, a seismic shift in her entire reality. "Listen for me in the music," he whispered, his voice fading. "Always in the music." The screen went black. The silence in the study was absolute, profound. Lindsay sat frozen, the weight of Cassian's hand on her shoulder the only thing tethering her to the earth. The hope was a live wire inside her, so powerful it was agony. His voice, rough and quiet, broke the silence. He loved you, more than anything. It was the truth she needed to hear. She turned her head, her wet cheek brushing against the back of his hand. She looked up at him and saw her own tumultuous emotions reflected in his stormy eyes. Not pity, but a fierce, shared understanding. He had his own ghosts, his own burdens. In that moment, the last of her defenses crumbled. The trust was now complete, a solid, unbreakable thing forged in shared secrets and a desperate, kindred hope. The days that followed were a strange, suspended reality. The knowledge that her father was alive somewhere was a constant humming energy beneath every thought, every action. The mansion was no longer a tomb. It was a command center, a place of waiting. Cassian was its steadfast commander. He installed a new, sophisticated security system, the quiet electronic beeps and the soft glow of status lights becoming new, reassuring sounds in the house. Lindsay found she could play her violin again, but the music was transformed. The melancholic adagios were gone. Now, her compositions were full of questing, hopeful themes, of searching melodies that reached for the horizon. She played with the window open, pouring the music out into the world, a beacon, a prayer. She was listening just as he'd asked. Cassian watched her, always from a respectful distance, but his presence was a constant, solid bass note in her new symphony. He began to share fragments of himself, the weight of a past life that demanded vigilance, the loss of his own family, the reason his eyes were so old in a young face. Their conversations were quiet, often happening in the soft light of evening, filled with long, comfortable silences that spoke more than words. One such evening, as a spectacular sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and violet, they stood on the porch. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine from the garden. "He'd be proud of you," Cassian said, his gaze on the darkening horizon. "The strength you have." "I didn't have it before you came," she admitted, softly, the truth of the words settling between them. He turned to look at her then, and the air shifted. The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with an intensity that had been building for weeks. The professional distance, the guarded walls, all of it fell away, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth. His eyes dropped to her lips for a fleeting second, and a jolt of pure, undiluted anticipation shot through her. Her heart hammered, not from fear, but from a longing so profound it stole her breath. The moment was shattered by the low, threatening purr of a car engine slowing down, on the street outside. It was the same car that had prowled past the house twice before. The spell broken, Cassian's posture changed instantly. The softness in his eyes vanished, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus she had seen the night of the break-in. The quiet. Neighbor was gone. The soldier was back. "Inside," he said, his voice low and firm, his hand gently guiding her back through the front door. "Now." As he closed and locked the heavy door behind them, the sound was a grim portent. The waiting was over. The peace had been a beautiful, fragile illusion. Orpheum was closing in. The world outside the locked door now tasted different. The sweet floral scent of jasmine that had filled the air moments before was now tainted with the acrid, oily smell of exhaust fumes that slithered through the keyhole. The beautiful, fiery oranges and violets of the sunset through the porch windows now looked like a warning, a sky bleeding at the edges of their fragile sanctuary. Inside, the familiar study felt like a cage. The warm, golden pool of light from The desk lamp now seemed small and defensive, pushing back against the oppressive darkness gathering at the windows. Every shadow in the corner of Lindsay's vision seemed to writhe and pulse with hidden threat. She could taste the sharp, metallic tang of her own fear on her tongue, a cold, coppery penny that made her want to gag. Cassian moved through the room with a silent, lethal grace that was both terrifying and deeply reassuring. He didn't speak. His actions were a language of their own. He checked the lock on the French doors, his fingers testing the bolt with a quiet, definitive thud that sounded like a shield slamming into place. He peered through the slats of the blinds, his profile etched in sharp relief by the dying light. Outside, the sight of him, so focused, so utterly capable, sent a confusing cocktail of terror and thrilling safety coursing through her veins. Her heart was a wild, caged thing beating against her ribs, its frantic rhythm a stark counterpoint to his controlled silence. He turned from the window, his stormy eyes finding hers in the dim light. "They're circling," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble that was an anchor in her rising panic. "They know we have something. The break-in was a probe. This is a hunt." The word hunt landed in her stomach like a shard of ice. She could almost see the word Orpheum now, not as typed letters on a folder, but as a slick black serpent coiling in the shadows around her home. For 3 days, the tension was a physical presence in the house, a fifth occupant that soured the milk and made the very dust taste of anxiety. Lindsay's music became strained, the searching melodies now threaded with dissonant, jarring chords that mirrored the tension coiling in her shoulders. She found herself jumping at the normal sounds of the house, the creak of a floorboard, the hum of the refrigerator, each one a potential threat. It was Cassian who finally broke the siege mentality. "We can't just wait for them to come through." "The door," he said one morning, his voice cutting through the thick silence at the breakfast table. The weak, pale yellow light of dawn did little to warm the room. "We need to understand what we're up against. We need to go to the source." "The source?" Her voice was a dry rasp. "Your father's old lab at the university. His research notes. His colleagues. There has to be something more there, a clue he left behind." The thought of leaving the house, of stepping out into the world where Orpheum was waiting, made her skin crawl. But the sight of Cassian's determined face, the steady, unwavering certainty in his gaze, gave her a courage she didn't know she possessed. He wasn't asking her to face it alone. He was asking her to fight alongside him. "Okay," she whispered, the word tasting of dust and resolve. "Okay." They went to the university library, a place that should have smelled of old paper and quiet wisdom. But to Lindsay, the air in the cavernous, silent halls now tasted of sterile threat. The endless rows of books were no longer a sanctuary of knowledge. They were a labyrinth where danger could be hiding behind every stack. The sight of the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished linoleum floor was blinding, exposing them, making them feel like insects under a microscope. They found a secluded carrel in the science wing, the air thick with the smell of ink and binding glue. Cassian's large, capable hands moved with quiet efficiency over the keyboard of a public terminal, accessing old faculty directories and research grant databases. Lindsay pored over a stack of her father's old published journals, the sight of his familiar handwriting in the margins, sending sharp, painful stabs of love and loss through her. The words on the page blurred, the complex mathematical formulas tasting like ash in her mind. It was in the profound, focused silence, broken only by the soft tap of keys and the rustle of pages, that the trap was sprung. A shadow fell over their table. Lindsay looked up, her breath catching in her throat. A man stood there, his face bland and forgettable, but his eyes were flat and cold, the color of a frozen lake. The air around him suddenly carried the faint, cloying scent of cheap cologne, a smell that felt violently out of place and utterly menacing. Cassian was on his feet in an instant, his chair scraping back with a sound that ripped through the library's quiet like a gunshot. He moved to put himself between Lindsay and the man, his body a solid wall of tension. "It would be easier for everyone if you just came with us, Miss Green," the man said, his voice a low, unpleasant monotone that tasted like grease at the back of her throat. From the periphery of her vision, Lindsay saw two other men emerge from the shadows between the bookshelves, their movements synchronized and predatory. The sight of them, their intent so clear and violent, turned the air in her lungs to ice. Cassian didn't hesitate. "Run," he commanded, his voice a low, sharp crack of energy. But there was nowhere to run. They were surrounded. The hunt was over. The confrontation had begun. The world narrowed to the space between the bookshelves. The air, once tasting of dust and knowledge, now crackled with the metallic tang of violence. The three men closed in, their movements a synchronized, predatory dance. Lindsay's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. But her eyes weren't on the threat. They were locked on the solid line of Cassian's back, a shield standing between her and the storm. He moved first, a blur of controlled motion. The first man lunged, and Cassian met him not with brute force, but with a devastating, efficient grace. A sharp block, a twist, and the man crumpled with a choked gasp against a bookshelf, the sound of his body impacting the wood a sickening thud that echoed in the silence. Lindsay's breath caught. She saw the focused intensity on Cassian's face, the way his jaw was set, the storm in his eyes now a whirlwind of pure, protective instinct. In that moment, he wasn't just a guardian. He was a force of nature. And the fierce, thrilling sight of him sent a jolt through her fear-paralyzed system. The second man came from the side. Cassian pivoted, his arm deflecting a blow meant for his head. But the third was already there, grabbing him from behind, pinning his arms. A strangled sound of pure terror escaped Lindsay's lips. The sight of Cassian restrained, of his strength, being overpowered, was more terrifying than any threat to herself. Their eyes met across the short, violent distance. His gaze wasn't frightened. It was a silent, urgent command. Now. Do something. Her father's research. The sonic key. Her fingers, clumsy with panic, fumbled for her phone. The world seemed to slow. She could see the triumphant gleam in the eyes of the man holding Cassian. She could see the subtle strain in the muscles of Cassian's neck as he fought against the hold. Their shared heartbeat pounded in her ears, a single frantic rhythm of two people fighting for their lives. Found the file, her thumb hovering over the screen. Her eyes flickered back to Cassian's. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was a transfer of trust, a passing of the torch. In that split second, their partnership was sealed in the heat of battle. She pressed play. The sound that erupted from her phone wasn't loud to them. It was a high, piercing frequency that felt like a needle driven directly into the eardrum, a physical vibration that rattled the teeth in her skull. The effect on the attackers was instantaneous and agonizing. They cried out, their hands flying to their ears, their faces contorted in pain. The man holding Cassian recoiled, his grip loosening. It was all the opening Cassian needed. He broke free, his elbow connecting with the man's jaw with a sharp, brutal crack. The man dropped like a stone. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, the library's fire alarm began to wail, a dissonant, blaring counterpoint to the fading sonic pulse. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and aggression. Cassian stood amidst the fallen men, his chest heaving, his knuckles raw. His eyes found hers again, and the storm in them had subsided, replaced by a look of such fierce, blazing pride that it stole the air from her lungs. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Without a word, his hands came up, one cupping her cheek, the other resting on her shoulder. His palm was warm and slightly rough against her skin, his touch a grounding, solid reality. After the chaos, his thumb gently brushed away a tear she hadn't even felt fall. "You," he breathed, his voice husky with adrenaline and awe, "are incredible." His gaze held hers, and the space between them hummed with an energy more potent than any sonic weapon. It was the energy of shared terror, of mutual triumph, of a bond forged in fire. Her heart was no longer beating frantically with fear. It was pounding with a wild, exhilarating rhythm that was all for him. She could feel the rapid, strong thrum of his own heartbeat through the hand on her shoulder, their two rhythms syncing into one powerful, united cadence. He didn't kiss her. The moment was too profound, too raw for that. But the way he looked at her, as if she were the most brilliant, brave creature he had ever seen, was more intimate than any kiss could ever be. It was a look that seeped into her soul, warming the coldest, most lonely parts of her. In the blaring cacophony of the alarm, they existed in a perfect, silent bubble of understanding. He was her shield, and she, in that moment, had been his sword. And together, they were unstoppable. The library alarms were a distant, irrelevant scream. The only sound that mattered was the ragged rhythm of their shared breath, the only sight the fierce, proud light in Cassian's eyes. His hand was still on her cheek, his thumb tracing a slow, deliberate path along her cheekbone. The touch was a brand, searing away the last remnants of her fear, leaving only a raw, trembling awareness of him. Her skin tingled where he touched. Her. A trail of fire that spread through her entire body, warming her from the inside out. He slowly lowered his hand, his fingers trailing down her arm until they found her own. He laced his fingers through hers, his grip firm and sure. "We have to go now." His voice was low, a husky command that vibrated through their joined hands. She could only nod, her voice lost to the overwhelming sensation of his skin against hers. He didn't let go. He led her through the chaotic halls, past startled students, and the flashing strobe lights, his hand a constant anchoring pressure. Every glance he shot over his shoulder to check on her was a physical caress, a silent promise that he would not let her go. Her heart beat a wild, joyous rhythm against her ribs, no longer from panic, but from the thrilling, terrifying certainty that she was falling, and he was the only solid ground left in the world. They burst out into the cool night air, the sudden quiet a shock to the system. The city lights glittered around them, but all Lindsay could see was the way the streetlights gilded the sharp line of his jaw, the intense focus in his eyes as he scanned the street for danger. He finally released her hand to open the car door, and the loss of contact felt like a sudden chill. But as he guided her into the passenger seat, his hand rested for a moment on the small of her back, a gesture so possessive and protective it made her breath catch. The drive home was wrapped in a charged, intimate silence. The soft hum of the engine was the only sound. She watched his profile as he drove, the way his hands, still marked from the fight, rested confidently on the steering wheel. Every so often his gaze would flicker from the road to her, a quick, burning glance that seemed to absorb her, to assure himself she was still there, still safe. Each glance was a silent conversation, a reaffirmation of the bond that had been welded in the heat of the library. When they arrived back at the mansion, the familiar silence felt different. It was no longer empty, but expectant, waiting to be filled with the new, unspoken truth between them. He closed the heavy front door behind them, the sound a final gentle thud that sealed them in their own private world. He turned to her, his back against the door, his eyes dark and unreadable in the dim foyer light. They stood mere feet apart, the air between them thick with everything that had been said and everything that had not. "Lindsay," he began, his voice, a low rumble that she felt in her bones. She didn't let him finish. She crossed the space between them, her steps silent on the marble floor, and stopped just before him, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the clean, sharp scent of his skin mingled with the night air. His breath hitched. His eyes dropped to her lips, and the intensity in them was a physical touch. Slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, she reached up and placed her hand flat against his chest. Through the soft fabric of his shirt, she felt the strong, steady beat of his heart. It was beating for her. The knowledge was a dizzying, beautiful truth. His own hand came up to cover hers, pressing it more firmly against his heart. His other hand lifted to cradle the side of her neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin just below her ear. "Cassian," she whispered, his name a prayer, a surrender, a beginning. That was all it took. He bent his head, and his lips found hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a conflagration. It was the release of weeks of tension, of guarded glances, of suppressed longing. It was the taste of shared fear and triumphant survival. His lips were firm and demanding, yet devastatingly tender. Her hands came up to clutch at his shoulders, holding on as the world tilted on its axis. The kiss was a silent symphony, more powerful and profound than any she had ever composed in her mind. It was a melody of safety, of desire, of a future she had never dared to imagine, and it was written just for them. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, they stayed forehead to forehead, their ragged breaths mingling in the quiet space. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "Ever." And as she stood there, wrapped in the solid strength of his arms, her ear pressed against the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart, Lindsay knew it was the truest thing she had ever heard. The silent sonata of her life had finally found its perfect resolving chord. The days that followed were painted in new colors, infused with new sounds. The mansion, once a cavern of echoes, now held a low, warm hum of contentment. The morning light streaming through the windows looked different, softer, kinder, gilding the dust motes in the air until they looked like floating gold. The silence was no longer a heavy blanket, but a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the small, intimate sounds of a shared life. The soft scrape of Cassian's chair at the breakfast table, the low murmur of his voice on a business call, the comforting rhythm of his breathing as he read beside her on the sofa. Lindsay's music transformed completely. The violin no longer produced haunting, searching melodies. Now the notes that flowed were rich and warm, woven with threads of gold and deep crimson. They were songs of safety, of a heart unfolding after a long winter. She played with the windows open, and the music that drifted out was no longer a lonely beacon, but a joyful declaration. She caught Cassian watching her sometimes, a soft, unguarded look in his eyes that made her fingers stumble on the strings and her heart perform a happy, fluttering rhythm against her ribs. It was a look that tasted like the sweetest honey, a look that felt like sunshine on her skin. One evening, they stood in the heart of the mansion's grand empty ballroom. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, painting silvery paths on the polished floor. It was a room built for parties and people, but it had known only silence for years. "It's too big for just us," Lindsay murmured, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. The words were not sad, but thoughtful. Cassian's hand found the small of her back, his touch now a familiar and thrilling constant. "Then we should fill it," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. He wasn't talking about parties. She knew it in her soul. She turned to look at him, and the moonlight caught the determined, loving set of his jaw. "Your father built this place as a sanctuary. For you," he continued, his gaze holding hers. "Let's honor that. Let's make it a sanctuary for others who need one." The idea bloomed in her chest, bright and beautiful. A children's home. A place where the silence would be banished by the sounds of laughter and life. It was the perfect, living tribute to her father's love. It was taking the fear and the loss and the shadows of Orpheum and transforming them into something radiant and good. Using her inheritance, they began the work. The silent ballroom was soon filled with the sounds of construction, the hopeful whir of saws, the solid bang of hammers. The scent of sawdust and fresh paint replaced the smell of dust. Lindsay poured her heart into every detail, choosing colors that were warm and bright, filling the library with books, the music room with instruments. She named it the David Greenhaven, and with every decision, she felt a piece of her fractured past heal, locked into place by the steady, unwavering presence of the man beside her. Weeks later, the haven was complete. The first children arrived, their voices and laughter ringing through the halls like the most beautiful music Lindsay had ever heard. The mansion was finally, truly alive. That night, they stood on the porch, watching the children play in the twilight. The air was sweet, with the scent of cut grass and the distant, savory smell of dinner from the kitchen. The sky was a deep, velvety blue, the first stars beginning to prick through the canopy. Cassian turned to her, his expression serious and tender. He took both of her hands in his thumbs stroking her knuckles. "Lindsay," he began, his voice thick with an emotion that made her heart swell. merging our lives to build this. It's been the greatest honor of my life. But I don't want to just build a sanctuary with you." He took a deep breath, his stormy eyes shining with a love so deep it stole her breath. "I want to build a life, a home, a family, right here." He reached into his pocket and dropped to one knee. In his palm rested a small velvet box. Inside, nestled against the dark fabric, was a ring. The stone was not a cold, perfect diamond, but a smooth, deep blue sapphire, the color of a twilight sky, flanked by smaller, fiery opals. It was unique, strong, and breathtakingly beautiful, just like their story. "This is my final offer," he said, a hint of his old, wry smile touching his lips, though his eyes were glistening. "A full partnership, a merger of hearts and souls. No exit clauses, forever. What do you say?" Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down Lindsay's face. She looked from the ring, a piece of the night sky offered to her, to the face of the man who had taught her heart to beat again, to the vibrant, joyful sanctuary they had built from the ashes of their past. She threw her arms around his neck, her yes, a laughing, tearful sob against his skin. Yes, 1,000 times yes. As he slid the ring onto her finger, the sound of children's laughter from inside the house seemed to rise in a chorus of blessing. He kissed her then, a seal on their promise, a beginning to their forever. And in her heart, Lindsay knew the greatest sanctuary had never been the house, but the love she had found within its walls. A year bloomed around the old mansion, softening, its edges with climbing roses and the bright, chaotic splashes of children's toys left joyfully on the lawn. The David Green Haven was no longer just a name on a deed. It was a living, breathing heart, its rhythm a steady, joyful pulse that had completely erased the old, mournful silence. The air, once tasting of dust and loneliness, now carried the warm, sweet scent of baking bread from the kitchen and the clean, sun-drenched smell of laundry drying on the line. Inside, the walls, which had once echoed only with Lindsay's solitary violin, now thrummed with a different, more beautiful music. The sound of a child's uninhibited laughter from the upstairs playroom was a sparkling, effervescent note, like the taste of citrus on a summer day. The gentle, patient murmur of a caregiver reading a bedtime story was a deep, soothing cello, line that warmed the soul. Lindsay moved through these sounds, her heart swelling with a profound, settled joy she had once thought impossible. On this particular evening, the setting sun bled liquid gold across the polished floors of the music room. The last rays caught the vibrant, chaotic splashes of children's artwork taped to the walls, setting them ablaze with color. Cassian leaned in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his gaze a tangible warmth on her skin. The sight of him there, in this home they had built together, his stormy eyes now calm and full of a deep, abiding love, was the most beautiful composition she had ever witnessed. She lifted her violin, the wood warm and familiar under her chin. She closed her eyes, and the first note that emerged was the old, questing theme, the melody she had crafted as a beacon for her father. It still held a whisper of that ancient longing, a taste like distant, bittersweet rain. But as she played, something new and powerful happened. The strong, unwavering theme of her life with Cassian, a melody that felt like the solid earth under her feet and the warm sun on her face, rose to meet it. The two melodies did not clash. They danced. They intertwined, the searching notes twining around the strong, foundational chords, transforming the question into a statement of profound faith. The music was no longer a cry into the void, but a testament. It spoke of a love that was her sanctuary, and a hope for her father that was her guiding star. She played for him, sending the notes through the open window, a lullaby woven from resilience and unwavering belief, carried on the jasmine-scented breeze. As the final shimmering note hung in the air, refusing to fully fade, she opened her eyes. Cassian was still watching her, his expression so full of pride and adoration it made her breath catch. From the hallway, the sound of a child's sleepy sigh drifted in, a soft, perfect punctuation to their evening. Lindsay lowered her violin, her heart not heavy with absence, but light with the fullness of a love that was both present and promised. The search would continue, but the silence was gone forever, replaced by the beautiful, unfinished symphony of a life built on hope and a love that had truly brought her home.